The Galactic Empire prided itself on centuries of conquest, a machine of order and expansion that believed nothing in the stars could resist its weight. At the heart of its command chambers, war drums echoed once again, for the Empire was preparing to annihilate its oldest rival coalition. Strategies were laid across holographic star maps, resources calculated, fleets mobilized, and the promise of absolute dominance spoke in every confident tone that filled the chamber. Yet among the voices of certainty, there was one that carried unease, one that did not celebrate but warned. An alien general, decorated by decades of campaigns and scars of survival, addressed the council not with triumph but caution. His words carried the gravity of someone who had seen too much destruction to be blinded by arrogance. He reminded them that power was not only measured in fleets and numbers but in will. With deliberate calm, he told the council to let one species remain untouched, uninvolved, and unprovoked in this war. That species was humanity. His suggestion was met with smirks, laughter, and disbelief. To the most powerful rulers in the galaxy, humans were insignificant, a young race barely a few centuries into interstellar travel, holding no ancient starforges, no vast alliances, no colossal armies. They were tolerated on the fringes of galactic politics and seen as stubborn yet ultimately harmless. To the Empire, the notion that such a minor species warranted concern in a war of titans was almost insulting. The general, however, had not spoken lightly. He recalled archives that most of the council had dismissed as primitive records. Wars on Earth before they had ever touched the stars, conflicts where they turned entire continents into graves yet emerged stronger. Their civilizations collapsed and rose again, each time more relentless than before. No other species had carried such a pattern of resilience. He described how humans thrived not in comfort but in struggle, how their history was not one of slow stability but of constant fire, chaos, and survival. He reminded them of encounters along the border where human explorers had survived hostile environments that had killed trained Imperial soldiers. He noted how their colonies adapted to climates deemed uninhabitable, creating thriving settlements in places where the Empire's engineered species had perished. But the Council did not listen. They dismissed humanity's survival stories as irrelevant anecdotes, the struggles of a desperate people clinging to life rather than shaping destiny. They saw neutrality as cowardice, restraint as weakness, and hesitation as proof that humanity lacked the courage to stand among the great powers. The general's warning was painted as paranoia, relic thinking from a soldier who valued caution too much to embrace inevitable conquest. They told him that when war began, no neutral world could remain untouched, and if humanity resisted, it would be crushed like any other obstacle. They saw themselves as invincible, wielders of fleets that could blot out suns, controllers of supply chains that spanned thousands of systems. How could a species without ancient power or grand fleets be worth even a moment's fear? The general said no more, though his silence weighed heavier than his words. He had seen empires fall not by strength of arms but by underestimating the wrong foe. He understood that humans were not dangerous because of what they possessed, but because of what they could become when pushed. He recognized in them something rare, a refusal to remain broken. To him, neutrality was not cowardice, it was patience, a decision born not from fear but from calculation. If left alone, they would remain quiet, content to build and expand in peace. But if provoked, if cornered, they would fight with a fury that was not taught but ingrained, and they would not stop until their enemies regretted every step taken against them. The chamber, however, was filled with arrogance. They laughed at the thought that one small species could shift the fate of empires. They pointed to statistics, reminding him that humans lacked the numbers, the ships, and the resources to stand against even a fraction of the Empire's might. They declared that neutrality was irrelevant. Sooner or later, every world served the Empire or was consumed by it. To them, the only mistake would be granting humans the illusion of choice. In their pride, they thought the stars were theirs to command and that warnings from veterans were nothing but the ramblings of overcautious minds. As the session closed, the general stepped out into silence, his thoughts grim. He had spoken his piece and had been ignored. The Empire would march forward, drunk on its own power, blind to the storm it was creating. And though humanity remained distant, Watching the galactic stage with quiet restraint, the general carried a certainty that lingered in the shadow of the council's laughter. The day the Empire pushed too far, the day it broke human neutrality, would be the day it learned a lesson it would never forget. The dismissal of the general's caution had been unanimous, yet he could not let go of the unease. The council measured strength in ships, numbers, and resources, but he measured it in how a species endured when stripped of all comforts. By those standards, humans were unlike any he had studied. They had been underestimated because the galaxy judged by appearances, and appearances betrayed them. Fragile bodies compared to armored species, shorter lifespans than long-lived empires, technology that seemed modest compared to civilizations with millennia of progress. To the Empire, humans were latecomers, arriving after the rules had already been written and the powers established. But this very perspective blinded them to what lay beneath the surface. Humans had developed in chaos, not in carefully preserved harmony. Their history was a record of wars that reshaped their planet countless times. They had fought not only each other but nature itself, enduring storms, plagues, famines, and extinctions that would have erased weaker species. Every time they collapsed, they rebuilt. Every time they suffered, they adapted. The general had studied their progression from fractured tribes to global civilizations, each era marked by conflict that honed rather than broke them. While other species avoided risk and prized stability, humans thrived in adversity. What most called catastrophe, they turned into opportunity. The Council could not comprehend this mindset because the Empire's power had insulated it from true desperation for centuries. For them, warfare was a matter of overwhelming force, calculated logistics, and inevitable victory. Humanity's warfare was different. They fought with whatever was at hand, bending rules, turning weakness into advantage. When starved of weapons, they improvised. When outnumbered, they ambushed. When betrayed, they struck back with vengeance that endured for generations. The archives contained examples of civilizations that underestimated them long before they reached the stars. Each had believed humans could be subjugated, and each had been shattered until nothing remained. The lesson was clear to the general, but forgotten by those who now laughed in their arrogance. Humans had chosen neutrality when the war drums of the galaxy began, but this was not weakness. It was restraint. They had no desire to join empires in their endless conquests, and their colonies prospered by staying apart. The Empire, however, mistook restraint for fear. To them, a refusal to pick a side was cowardice. They saw a species unwilling to assert dominance, and in the Galactic Council's language, unwillingness was equivalent to weakness. This blindness was dangerous, for it meant they misread the most important signal. Humans had no interest in aggression until aggression was forced upon them. That patience was not passivity, it was a choice. The general understood that their strength was not in scale but in unpredictability. No algorithm could predict how humans would respond under pressure. They were capable of sacrifice on scales that defied logic, throwing themselves into battles with no chance of survival simply to buy time or inflict one decisive wound. They could unite under threat faster than most empires, casting aside internal rivalries in the face of a common enemy. They had an ability to turn desperation into invention, producing strategies and tools in weeks that took others decades. Against them, wars were never clean, never simple, never predictable. Against them, victories could become traps and defeats could be transformed into sudden resurgence. Yet the Empire remained blind. They laughed at the stories of human adaptability as barbaric legends. They called their old wars primitive savagery, and claimed it had no place in modern warfare. They dismissed the very traits that made humans unique: tenacity, ingenuity, and a will that refused to break. And in their arrogance, they convinced themselves that even if neutrality was ignored, humanity would fold quickly, unable to withstand the sheer magnitude of imperial power. The Council calculated only in fleets and weapons, not in willpower, not in the capacity of an enemy to endure until the stronger side exhausted itself. The general's warning had been clear: neutrality was not a weakness to exploit but a shield to respect. By leaving them alone, the Empire could ensure they remained observers, not participants. By pushing them, the Empire would invite something far more dangerous than opposition. it would awaken a relentless determination. To underestimate them was to gamble against a force that had never truly known surrender. Humanity's danger was not in what they possessed at the moment, but in what they could become when forced to fight. That was the truth the general saw with clarity, but his vision was drowned in the echo of arrogant laughter. The Empire believed the galaxy was already theirs, that all who resisted would be assimilated or destroyed. Humanity was the exception they refused to see. They believed neutrality would crumble into submission. But the general knew that if the Empire mistook patience for weakness, the galaxy would learn too late that humans did not yield. They endured, they resisted, and when finally provoked, they struck with a ferocity that burned itself into memory. The Council could not imagine it yet, but the seeds of that reckoning were already waiting in silence, buried beneath their arrogance, ready to grow the moment the Empire overstepped. The war between the Empire and its rivals ignited with full fury. Systems burned, fleets clashed, and resources drained faster than they could be replenished. The Empire's vast supply lines stretched across thousands of light years, and though their armadas were massive, the demands of constant warfare exposed cracks. As desperation grew, the Council looked toward worlds not officially involved, weighing them not as sovereign but as opportunities. Among those worlds stood human colonies, small but strategically valuable, rich in minerals and positioned along critical trade routes. Neutrality was forgotten the moment expedience whispered in the Council's ears. At first, the violations were subtle. Imperial ships borrowed fuel from human depots, promising repayment that never came. Patrols trespassed into human-controlled zones under the excuse of necessity. When protests were raised, they were dismissed with arrogance. Soon, subtle theft became open seizure. Human freighters were commandeered under imperial authority, their crews insulted, sometimes imprisoned, occasionally killed. Colonies that had declared neutrality found their resources extracted as if they were already annexed. Humanity, patient in restraint, issued warnings. They asked the Empire to withdraw, to respect the line they had drawn. The response was ridicule, the same laughter that had greeted the alien general's earlier warning. The Empire miscalculated, believing silence would continue forever. They failed to see that each act of trespass was being recorded, each insult remembered, each life taken tallied. Humanity was not blind, nor powerless, nor intimidated. They were watching, weighing every injustice, storing each violation as fuel for a fire not yet unleashed. The final breach came when the Empire attempted conscription. Entire human colonies were forced at gunpoint to provide recruits for imperial fleets. Young men and women were dragged from their homes, pressed into wars they had no desire to fight. That was the moment patience ended. A single transmission was delivered across imperial channels, sharp in tone and chilling in clarity. Withdraw from our worlds, release our people, or face consequences you cannot imagine. The words carried no theatrics, no elaborate threats, only cold certainty. But the Council, drunk on its own dominance, mocked the ultimatum. They dismissed humanity's anger as the protests of weaklings unable to grasp the scale of true war. They assumed that if humans dared to resist, it would be nothing more than scattered skirmishes easily crushed beneath imperial fleets. Then came the first sign that the Empire had stepped into something far larger than it anticipated. Convoys carrying resources from human colonies began vanishing. Patrols that once crossed neutral space with impunity never returned. Ships sent to investigate found wreckage, imperial vessels disabled with precision, cargo removed, crews gone without trace. What had been expected to be acts of desperation revealed themselves as coordinated strikes. The Empire still misread the pattern, assuming it was defiance destined to collapse quickly. They thought humanity was stalling, lashing out in fear before inevitable defeat. What they did not realize was that these were not tests. They were deliberate moves in a war already unfolding. For the alien general, every new report only confirmed the warnings he had spoken. He could see the familiar pattern. Humans did not announce war with grand declarations. They slid into conflict with subtlety, shifting from patience to vengeance without ceremony. By the time enemies realized, it was too late. To the Empire, these strikes looked minor, but to him, they were evidence of a deeper truth. Humans were not preparing for battle, They had already begun, quietly, methodically, and with a clarity of purpose the Empire could not match. The Council, however, remained blind. They focused on numbers, on how many ships they could send, on how many troops they could deploy. They saw the first skirmishes as trivial annoyances to be brushed aside. But beneath that arrogance, they failed to notice how fear was beginning to spread through their ranks. Captains whispered of unseen enemies striking from shadows. Merchants feared routes that once felt safe. Soldiers pressed into human colonies grew restless, speaking of resistance that fought with unnatural ferocity. For every act of imperial might, there was a response, measured, precise, and growing bolder with each passing week. Humanity had spoken clearly. Neutrality had been their gift, not their weakness. The Empire, in ignoring that, had forced them to reveal the side of themselves they had kept hidden. Now, every strike was no longer just retaliation, it was a declaration. The patience had ended, the silence was broken, and the storm that the general had feared for so long was finally moving. The Empire still thought it faced an enemy too small to matter. In truth, it had awoken a force that would not rest until every violation was answered and every arrogance shattered. The first waves of resistance had been dismissed as scattered outbursts, but the illusion of insignificance did not last. What began as raids on convoys evolved into calculated campaigns that struck across entire sectors with precision. Human fleets, though smaller in scale, appeared and vanished like phantoms. No system was truly safe. Communications broke down at critical moments, supply lines collapsed without warning, and strongholds once deemed impregnable were breached through tactics the Empire had never encountered. The arrogance that once filled the council chambers began to sour into unease. Reports arrived too frequently to be ignored, each one carrying the same unsettling truth: the enemy was not fighting for survival, they were orchestrating a war on their own terms. The brilliance of their approach lay in how asymmetrical it was. The Empire had been built on overwhelming numbers, crushing resistance with sheer might, advancing like a tide that could not be stopped. Humans refused to meet them on those terms. Instead, they turned every advantage the Empire possessed into a liability. When Imperial fleets advanced in overwhelming formation, they struck at unguarded flanks. When command networks coordinated entire campaigns, they infiltrated systems and severed the lines, leaving fleets blind and vulnerable. Even the Empire's most sophisticated artificial intelligences, thought to be beyond corruption, began malfunctioning under cyber intrusions so advanced that commanders were forced to return to slower manual methods. The war machine that once moved with clockwork precision began to stumble. The psychological front proved even more devastating. Humans understood that wars were not only fought with weapons but with perception. They broadcasted every act of imperial exploitation across the galaxy, spreading truth in raw and unfiltered streams. Worlds under imperial rule watched and began to question their masters. Colonies that had lived under silent obedience now whispered rebellion. When imperial troops attempted to silence these voices, they found themselves hunted not just by soldiers but by civilians who had decided that the time for fear was over. The seeds of resistance spread wider with each human transmission, turning the Empire's image of invulnerability into one of fragility. Alliances shifted. Rivals who once fought cautiously against the Empire suddenly found in humanity a partner whose courage reignited their own. The example was irresistible: a species with fewer ships, fewer soldiers, and fewer resources standing against a power that had dominated for centuries, and winning battles through will and ingenuity. Rebel factions aligned themselves with human fleets, offering safe harbors, intelligence, and reinforcements. What had begun as isolated defiance transformed into a network of insurrections that stretched across regions the Empire once controlled with absolute authority. For the first time in living memory, the foundations of imperial dominance trembled. The alien general, bound still by duty to the Empire, could not deny the grim satisfaction of being proven right. Each development echoed the warnings he had given, each failure of the Empire confirming the blindness of its arrogance. He recognized the unfolding pattern as something inevitable. Humanity was not improvising in panic, they were executing strategies born from centuries of conflict on their own world, sharpened and perfected long before they reached the stars. What unsettled him most was their relentlessness. Unlike empires that sought conquest for wealth or dominance, humanity fought with a drive that seemed personal. Every violation, every injustice was remembered, and every strike carried with it the weight of vengeance. The Empire tried escalation. They sent larger fleets, mobilized elite divisions, unleashed weapons meant to overwhelm. Yet each time, their efforts unraveled. Humanity never stood and fought where the enemy was strongest. They dictated where battles happened, how long they lasted, and when they ended. Imperial admirals, trained for predictable engagements, found themselves chasing shadows. A victory would be declared in one system, only to discover 3 others lost while their fleets had been misdirected. Entire campaigns collapsed under the weight of human unpredictability. The final blow to imperial confidence came when one of their grand armadas, tasked with reclaiming rebellious sectors, was led into an elaborate trap. Navigation systems were hijacked mid-transit, scattering ships across hostile territory. Some vessels collided with debris fields seeded intentionally, others were forced into ambushes waiting in silence. What should have been a demonstration of imperial dominance became a massacre, with survivors limping back in fragments, their morale shattered. The once unshakable image of imperial superiority dissolved as soldiers whispered that they were not facing rebels. They were facing predators who understood them better than they understood themselves. Whispers spread beyond military circles. Citizens began to question whether the Empire's might could protect them at all. Subjugated worlds rose in open defiance, emboldened by human broadcasts that promised solidarity in struggle. What the Council had dismissed as isolated resistance had grown into a tide that even their numbers could not suppress. Each strike, each disruption, each revelation of corruption weakened the illusion of control. The galaxy was no longer watching the Empire, it was watching the humans. And through it all, the same truth rang clear. Humanity had not wanted this war. They had asked only to remain neutral, to be left in peace. But peace had been stolen, and in its place emerged a fury disciplined by patience and sharpened by survival. What the Empire once dismissed as weakness was revealed to be the very trait that made humanity undefeatable. They did not fight as conquerors, but as a species that refused to be broken, and with every passing day, their enemies realized the cost of ignoring the one warning that could have spared them from ruin. The Empire, cornered by its own arrogance, chose desperation over humility. Its council ordered a final offensive against Earth itself, believing that striking at humanity's cradle would end the resistance in a single decisive act. Armadas were mobilized, tens of thousands of ships converging with the intention of erasing not just a species but their memory. Propaganda declared it the ultimate campaign, the blow that would remind the galaxy who held dominion. But while the Empire moved with fanfare and arrogance, humanity prepared with quiet certainty. For them, the war had never been about spectacle, it had always been about survival, and survival demanded precision. When the fleets approached, they expected terror. Instead, their sensors revealed human forces appearing across the void in numbers the Empire had never anticipated. Entire armadas emerged from hidden stations, from deep space outposts, from reserves that had been kept deliberately unseen until this moment. What had been dismissed as a scattered nuisance now revealed itself as a coordinated force stretching across systems. Every Imperial fleet that advanced found itself mirrored by human formations that had studied them for years. What followed was not a battle of desperation but a demonstration of control. The first strike severed Imperial command networks. Flagships that coordinated hundreds of vessels were reduced to silence as communications collapsed under calculated disruption. Admirals, accustomed to instant clarity, were left blind, their orders lost in the chaos. Human fleets did not engage in drawn-out duels. They struck like blades, carving into critical points, crippling engines, destroying supply ships, and leaving larger vessels stranded and vulnerable. Imperial formations disintegrated not from lack of numbers but from the sudden realization that their overwhelming scale meant nothing when they could not see, could not move, and could not trust their own systems. Across the galaxy, simultaneous strikes unfolded. Shipyards that had fed the Imperial machine for centuries erupted in fire, sabotaged with precision that revealed years of planning. Military hubs were obliterated in single campaigns, their defenses bypassed through means the Empire had never conceived. Leaders who had mocked humanity were targeted directly, assassinated with efficiency that left no chance for recovery. The Empire had believed humanity incapable of waging war on such a scale, yet in days, the heart of their strength was gutted. It was not chaos, it was orchestration, every move deliberate, every strike carrying the weight of promises humanity had made when neutrality was violated. What shattered imperial pride most was the message broadcast at the height of the conflict. Across every channel, every screen, every receiver, the same words appeared: "We asked for neutrality. You demanded war. Now you will have it until you beg for peace." There was no rage in the tone, no desperation, only certainty. Those words echoed in the minds of soldiers, citizens, and rulers alike. For the first time, the Empire faced an enemy who did not seek their lands or riches but their submission. Humanity was not fighting for expansion, they were fighting for memory, for respect, for vengeance, and that made them unstoppable. As imperial fleets shattered, whispers spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Stories of humans dismantling entire campaigns with surgical precision, of worlds rising against their oppressors under human guidance, of soldiers refusing to yield even when surrounded. Fear replaced arrogance, and with fear came the collapse of loyalty. Territories once tightly controlled declared independence, no longer believing in the Empire's promise of protection. The myth of invincibility dissolved, replaced by the undeniable truth that the Empire had underestimated the wrong enemy. The alien general, long dismissed and dishonored for his warnings, watched in grim silence as the outcome unfolded exactly as he had foreseen. The laughter that once filled council chambers was gone, replaced by frantic pleas for strategies that no longer existed. His words, "Let the humans stay neutral," echoed like a prophecy fulfilled. The irony was bitter, for the cost of ignoring him had not merely been defeat but humiliation on a galactic scale. He knew now that the lesson humanity had delivered would last for generations. When the war ended, it was not through negotiation on equal terms but through surrender. The Empire did not dictate peace, it begged for it. Humanity did not seek conquest, for they had never wanted an empire of their own. They simply demanded what they had asked for from the beginning: respect, independence, and freedom from interference. The price for ignoring that request had been the dismantling of the greatest power the galaxy had known. The scars left behind were not only in broken fleets and shattered worlds but in memory, carved into the collective fear of every species who had witnessed what humans became when provoked. In the end, the galaxy understood what the general had seen from the beginning. Humanity's strength was not in their fleets, nor in their weapons, but in their refusal to surrender, in their relentless will that outlasted every calculation. The Empire had sought to make an example of them. Instead, they had become the example burned into history, that to underestimate humans was to invite ruin. And though the guns fell silent, the echo of their warning remained, a lesson whispered across stars: that neutrality had been mercy, and that the storm they unleashed when denied it would never be forgotten.